Hi, everyone. My name is Stan Ponder, and I am out of St. Louis, Missouri. I work with Sketch Development Services based out of St. Louis as well, but I've also spun up my own side endeavor called Continuous Evolution. And this talk was given at Agile 2026 for Agile Alliance and the Project Management Institute, PMI, and it received a lot of positive feedback. So I thought that I would get this information out there so that anyone that might benefit from it can hear it. So hopefully you like it, but I would love any feedback, anything I could do better, or any thoughts or things that you may disagree with. I would love to have that discussion. You can always reach out to me. So we'll give you that information at the end, but let's get started. So a lot of times when I hear talks about transformations at scale, usually it devolves into kind of a blame game almost for leaders, things like that. So there's two mindsets that I really want us to capture in this little chat that I'm putting on here. And number one, that leaders, yes, are absolutely part of the equation, but we are not powerless to influence. And if we think that we are, then we're probably not in the right organization for us anyway. Number two, transformations are inevitable. If we stay stale, we go the way of Nokia. We definitely want to make sure that we're continuing to evolve and continuing to get better at what we do. So any organization that really wants to stay relevant has to make a transformation. Now, there's a lot about that could go sideways, and we're going to talk about that today. Now, the other thing I want to bring up before we get started into the content here is that the concepts that I'm going to talk about will apply to any Agile methodology, whether you're running SAFe, Scrum, Kanban, Scrumban, Less, DAD, Fast, it doesn't matter. Any of those methodologies, the concepts here will absolutely apply. Second, it doesn't matter what kind of transformation we're talking about either. Granted, this talk was given at Agile 2026, so that it is geared toward a more of an agile transformation, but it can be for a digital transformation, an AI governance transformation, any kind of transformation that your organization might be going through, this will apply. All right. And finally, and I think most importantly, regardless of your role in the organization, this will apply to you. There are things in here that you can take away regardless of what you do for the organization. So that being said, let's get started. First of all, before we even dive into why they fail, let's talk about why they even exist in the first place. And if you're not aware why your organization has undergone a transformation or will be undergoing a transformation, you should probably ask, but it usually falls into one or more, sometimes all six of these buckets. The first one is adaptability. We want to be able to pivot faster because when we try to make a change, it takes too long, or it's too cumbersome, or there's too much rework, things like that. Our delivery isn't where we want it to be. We want to be able to ship better, faster, things like that. Alignment is the next one. We have silos, whether they're within our IT organization or between IT and the business. Sometimes it's across teams, sometimes it's across the organization, sometimes it's both. And we want to improve that alignment. Responsiveness. We definitely want to get things to our customers and our users faster. We want a good time to market down. We want to make sure that we try to get these features, these outcomes into the hands of our folks as fast as possible. Visibility is another one. We just don't have insight into the work. We don't know where things are. We want more feedback loops. And finally, and more broadly, outcomes. We're just not seeing specific outcomes that we're looking for, and we think that a transformation might be able to improve that. Now, when we do a transformation, we generally see the same kind of pattern. There are things that change, and there are things that don't. So generally what we see change is we'll bring in some new ceremonies or meetings or events or whatever you want to call them, but there's some new ways of working that we try to put in place. We might bring in some tooling. We might bring in a framework, whether it's Agile or AI or whatever. Or we're probably going to change our team structures, who reports to whom sometimes, or just the number of teams, how they're structured, what they work on, things like that. Now, what generally happens is some of these things stay the same though, and that is your overall governance in your organization, your architecture practices and processes, the funding models, your leadership model, and the decisions where they're made. Generally, those things don't change in a transformation. Now, good consultancies will come in and they will suggest some of those things may need to change or shift, but that's usually not part of what happens in a transformation. Now, what I'm going to do next is there are a couple of times when I bring in quotes that I've heard from direct leaders or senior leaders in organizations where I've been part of many transformations, more than half a dozen at this point in my career. And these were never angry or malicious comments in any way, shape, or form. They're by leaders that generally are thinking these things. And I'm thankful that they were honest about those because, without that, it's very, very hard to really understand where leaders are coming from. So trying to get in that mindset and understand where they are is very important. So first one is I was working with a group and one of the senior leaders said, I didn't think I needed to know anything about this agile stuff. I thought that was just for the teams. And that is absolutely true. It is for the teams, but it's for leaders too. And my comment back was, well, if an agile transformation is like a bus ride, you're not in the back seat, you're driving. And that is absolutely the case. So what when we talk about transformations, they generally are taken as a way for us to fix things, right? Like it's going to fix all these things. Once the teams do these things and they become agile, then a lot of our problems are going to go away. But the reality is that transformations increase visibility, but the organization then needs time to improve their capabilities. And that's one of the main differentiators between what a transformation is and isn't. So it shines a light on the problems, but it doesn't generally fix most of them. So let's talk about that. What are you going to see? Well, again, anything that is part of a transformation becomes visible, but those capabilities take a lot longer to change and shift. So, for example, dependencies being identified across teams. Absolutely, that is something that is visible, becomes visible as part of a transformation. Do you get more transparency into your blockers? Yes, you absolutely do. Can teams escalate risks earlier? Sure, because now they can see them, so they can escalate them. Can we make faster decisions? Well, that is a capability. That is something that has to happen, and it has to have team members that are able to make said decisions. It has to have leadership that's able to say, we're going to push these decisions now to the teams that we used to make decisions about. That's a capability, and it takes time and effort and practice. Can we reduce coordination or planning friction that exists in our organization? Again, that's a capability. We can shine a light and see that friction better or see some of those gaps in coordination, but it takes time to build that capability. Can we adapt our governance or increase our autonomy? Again, that's a capability. It takes time to change those things. Can we make our technical constraints visible? Of course, yes, we can see where we may have some technical constraints. But does our architecture now support adaptability? That is a capability that gets built over time. So speaking of visibility over capability, another senior leader, I was sitting in a meeting once and we had just quote unquote finished the transformation, and there were still some struggles across some of the teams. And the senior leader said, we train them on how to be safe. Why are they still struggling? And this person is extremely intelligent person. So again, not being malicious in any way, shape, or form, but we had visibly been able to see that there were gaps in training. So we gave the training, and now the teams individuals need months of practice, of repetition. And at the same time, it's not like we stop doing all the work that the teams are doing. So it's not like they have time to just practice all this nonstop. It's now I go back to my regular job where I'm working really, really hard. And now I also have to try to change how I work, how I think every day. So it does take a lot of time, and those capabilities take a long time to build. Now, here's where we're going to spend the rest of the time. We're going to talk about the 6 constraints that I've not only observed, but in my research that I've done for this talk have built up. So there are 6 areas where I feel that these constraints show up often in a transformation, and they are where the real problems start to come up. And like I said at the beginning, yes, leadership definitely plays a role in this, in an evolution. If we're really going to evolve ourselves as an organization, then this is part of it. You also have your governance and your decision systems that sometimes involve leadership, but a lot of times it's beyond just your leadership team. Your organizational design and the dependencies that exist in your organization, your planning and funding models, your technical architecture, and your incentives and metrics. So we're going to dive into each one of those just a little bit more, and we're going to talk about a tool that I was able to develop that I will make available upon request. So let's talk about a typical path of a transformation. So first of all, transformation begins. Someone recognizes somewhere we need to change how we're working. Let's do a transformation. And some people get excited, some may get nervous, some may just decide to start looking for another job because they've not had a good experience. But either way, transformation begins. The first thing we notice is we start increasing our transparency. Again, we flip that switch, shine a light on things. We start to see things that we didn't see before. But then we start to recognize that a constraint becomes visible. We see like, oh, this isn't being changed by the transformation. It's kind of a problem. But nobody ever taught us how to change that. And that's not part of the transformation. It's not in the Scrum guide. It's not part of SAFe. It's not in Kanban's methodology, right? It's just a thing that exists in our organization. So we start to get frustrated because we don't know how to change it. And then we recognize that there's another constraint and then more frustration. But unfortunately, this is where the transformation usually ends because we have a finish line. We say, we're done. We're agile now, or we're an AI first company now. And so we recognize that we have these constraints, but and different people in the organization, be they leaders, be they folks on the teams, they get more and more frustrated until one of three paths usually emerges. First path, we start the next transformation. We say, well, that didn't work. So what's next? And we try the next hot flavor or hot topic or whatever other organizations are trying. The second one is we say we're just going to live with it. And if y'all don't like it, you can start looking for another place because this is how we're going to just keep working right now. So if it's frustrating to you, we're sorry. Or the third one is we start bringing back old practices. I've seen everything from, bringing back change orders, take weeks of time and effort and energy between the generation of paperwork and going through the different levels of approvals that have to happen for what sometimes amounts to a very quick change. And I've seen organizations that go back to, running more PRDs, creating these 200-page or 50-page product requirements documents that try to get everything from beginning to end, even though we know that after the first 5 pages get developed, the rest of it has to change, and that document now becomes relatively useless. We're doing it the right way. So that's kind of what we see with transformations, and I'm hoping and thinking that most of you listening to this right now probably can empathize with this. So why does that happen? Well, let's talk about those different constraint areas that I mentioned, and let's talk about what they look like, and then how you might be able to influence that regardless of where you sit in the organization. So the first one is, sometimes with leadership, agility gets delegated downward, meaning that, we think that only the teams need to change. And guys, like I said, I've sat in that leadership role and I've thought the same thing that, hey, once the team's better at this, then, we're going to be good to go. Everything's going to be great. Another one is that, autonomy said, you're a self-organizing team now, you're an autonomous team now. And so teams think that they're about ready to start driving, but then they realize that leadership is still kind of driving behind the scenes. Now, again, I want to be really clear here. 99.9% of the time, this isn't like a leadership malicious activity. For me specifically, I know that I'm guilty of this. It's because we've gotten in the habit of making these decisions over our careers, and all of a sudden, when that changes, we still are in the habit of making that decision. We're not consciously thinking about it. So another one that generally can happen is that leadership is focused on the status, not the outcomes or the improvements that the team is making. So they're asking for dates. And to be fair, a lot of times the leadership team is under tremendous pressure to deliver things, and the customers don't care that we're quote unquote becoming agile. They really don't. They just want to see results. They want to see outcomes. They want to see things out there. They want to see these features or whatever it is that they're waiting for. Another one is that there might not be space for learning. We've got that plane in the air and we got to keep building it while it's in the air. We can't ground it and then build it and then take off again. That pace just continues, or it even increases sometimes, because there's a theory sometimes that Agile will make things faster. Really, it's about increasing those feedback loops. So these are all things that can happen sometimes. So if that feels relevant to you, if that feels like something you're going through, then this is an area in which you have constraints. So what can you do about it from where you are? One is clarifying that decision ownership. Like I said, sometimes we get in the habit of making decisions and not realizing that it's time for the team to make those decisions. So sometimes just asking your leadership, whoever's making that decision, say, hey, is this something that the team can start deciding now or moving forward with? And sometimes you'd be surprised that a leader might say, oh my gosh, you're right. I didn't even think about that. I didn't realize I was still doing that. Sometimes you can ask for forgiveness rather than permission. But I would also say that a right answer, more than that, is to say, can I run an experiment? Find one realm or a product or team that maybe has a little less visibility. Maybe it's something internal. Say, can we try making the XYZ decisions with this team? Sometimes that could have great results, and then you can scale it from there. Sometimes, believe it or not, leaders want to help. Leaders don't want to be a constraint. And so sometimes if you shift the conversations towards giving leaders status and say, hey, here's where I can use some help. Can you help me with this? A lot of times you might be surprised how often a leader may want to jump in and say, sure, sounds great. Or redefine your leadership participation, right? If they're off the side and not in the daily meetings or the weekly meetings or whatever, where you need them, where those decisions need to occur, you can suggest that, hey, can you come to this meeting every week because this is where we decide this? And the leader may say, well, no, I can't. I've got too many other meetings. I know that was my thing. So what you can then say is, great. What if we go ahead and make the decision, but then I share that decision with you? And if you want us to pivot, we are happy to do that. Sometimes you can get a lot of headway with that as well. So those are some things you can do if this is a constraint area for you to kind of influence and shift some of that, some of those issues. Let's talk about governance and decision systems. What does this look like? Approval bottlenecks. And this isn't just with leaders. Sometimes there's other groups or other people that can sometimes be that bottleneck. I know that an organization I worked at once had an architect that was spread so thin between multiple teams that sometimes getting an answer from that person took about a week. And so what we would have to do is, team can't just sit there and wait. We would start to work ahead anyway. And then sometimes those decisions would come in and we would have to make changes and do rework. And it was a mess. It was very inefficient. Another thing, and this is the biggest complaint that I usually get from engineers when there's an agile transformation: too many meetings, ceremony overload. And if you've never done a ways of working workshop, we should talk, because I will tell you that a lot of times when I've done ways of working workshops with teams, with middle leaders, your delivery leaders, your scrum masters, your release train engineers, coaches, engineering managers, people like that, it's very surprising when you ask, say, hey, what's the value we're supposed to get out of this meeting? A lot of times they may not be able to articulate that, and there's a problem right there. But sometimes they do know, and they're just recognizing then that, hey, we're not getting that value. And usually the answer is immediately, well, let's scrap that meeting then. And I always kind of throw up the timeout signal and say, hold on, are we getting that value somewhere else? And I will give you one more thing. If you are a leader or somebody who's not an engineer, when you do an agile transformation, your goal for a lot of these meetings is to increase collaboration. And I can tell you that in a lot of organizations, in a lot of places, engineers were already collaborating. Maybe not in the way that was the most efficient, but they were already talking and collaborating. So if that's happening somewhere else, try to combine that, whatever they were doing in there. Ask the team, what are they doing already, or what were they doing, and how can we play that into what already exists? Or should we cancel one of these quote unquote new meetings so that the team is already getting that value by doing what they were doing before? That may be possible. So run those ways of working workshops. And like I said, if you've never done it before, happy to talk you through that. Another thing that can often happen with your governance and decision systems is you have too many people that are trying to steer the ship. And when too many people are trying to turn the ship doesn't go anywhere. It just sits in the middle of the ocean and doesn't move. And so this delays your prioritization and your ability to move forward. So what can you do if any of this resonates with you? What are some things you can do? One is you can map your decision latency. There was a time when we were trying to get a decision made, and what I did was I actually mapped out, just like a process flow, I mapped out the decision flow, including the time between each step. 3 days here for this leader to make a decision, 5 days for this person to make their decision. This committee, we had to wait for that next meeting. And I'm not even joking. When I did that, the approval process took longer than the work itself did, And so it was very obvious that we needed to make some shifts. I showed that to one of the senior leaders, and she immediately said, well, that's got to change. And immediately we worked together to propose a new path, a way for things to move through that process much faster. So simplifying those approval paths is another way to do that. Sometimes you can do that experimentally. Again, find a less visible, maybe internal team or product and say, can we try running this new process with this team, see how it works, and iron out the kinks, and then we can try it with other teams. And then maybe sometimes just clarifying those escalation boundaries and paths. If you've ever, had cable issues before, I think we all know this, or satellite issues, you usually call your provider, and the first thing they always say is, hey, have you tried plugging in, plug it back in? At this point, even my 70-plus-year-old mother knows to unplug it and plug it back in first before she calls anybody. So a lot of times when, we've escalated stuff to leaders, they may say, well, have you tried this? Well, yeah, I've already tried that. Or sometimes they may say, well, go try it again, right? But if you go ahead of time and document, say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Leader, when I bring something to you, here's the things I've already done. And here's what I would love for you to do, and work together to hammer that out. They may have some things they want you to do before you escalate, or not, or maybe they even want less. And then you can work together to figure out, here's where I would love for you to be able to take this and run with it. So sometimes just having that can make that escalation path and that process go a lot faster. All right, let's talk about organizational design and dependencies. What does this look like? If any of these feel familiar to you, then this is where you have some constraints. And this would be dependency heavy roadmaps or delivery plans, right? So, and I'm not just talking technical dependencies. I'm talking, we've got to work with this team over and then this team, or across, if we're running safe, this art and this art, and there's no way around it. We have to, before we can make any changes in product A, we have to also run it by the teams that own products B, C, and D, because one change in this product is going to require all these other changes in these other products. So, and we have to deploy that at the same time. So, because otherwise it'll break these other products. If you have that is an organizational design problem. The other side of that is, hey, we've developed all these things in silos and they don't talk to each other. And now all of a sudden we need them to. Well, the organization or the architecture behind the scenes is not compatible. And what should be a very simple connection between things that should take a couple of days for somebody to do takes weeks or even months sometimes, because we have built these things in such different ways. Another thing to kind of think about here is that sometimes optimization decreases as you scale. So when you try to bring on more teams, and your organization gets bigger, or you're having more products or things like that, some overhead increase is absolutely going to happen. You can't scale across an organization and not have some of this happen. But generally, we overdo this. I know that I was in an org once that had a 90-minute weekly art sync that had a ton of people in it. And I would talk to the people that were in this art sync every week, and they would say things like, yeah, 5 minutes of this meeting applies to me, or 20 minutes, or none of it at all, or I just stopped going and nobody's realized it yet, right? So that is obviously a very expensive meeting that maybe the roster of people that needed to attend wasn't correct. Hard to say, but there is definitely an issue there. So what can you do if this is something that you see in your organization? One, you can identify your dependency hotspots, right? Like, this is where we just have way too much overlap, and then figure out who are the right people in the room to help solve that problem. Because it may not be leadership. It might be architects, it might be product people, it might be your engineering managers. It's hard to say, but try to figure out who should be the ones to help resolve this dependency hotspot. Again, visualizing or mapping this is just much like you could do for approval paths or things like that. You can do that for these friction patterns. Hey, every time we deploy, here's the process that we have to go through, and it has all these swim lanes just because it's so convoluted, or there's so much overlap. Another one is you could align your ownership boundaries incrementally. Hey, what if we move this service or this product over to this team? Like, this would decrease the number of dependencies between these two teams by 30%, or, save us X amount of time per sprint, per quarter, whatever. Kind of coming up with brainstorming some of those things where you might be able to make a slight shift might be able to increase that ability to get things done, that efficiency. All right, so let's go into another executive comment. This is a pretty common one. I've actually heard this one many times. Agile was supposed to mean faster. I have no idea when things get done now or why it takes longer. Why does that happen? Well, because first of all, sometimes Agile gets sold as a silver bullet for everything, and it really isn't. But sometimes, when that happens, the status reporting for senior leaders goes away, but the people that are closer to the work see the work a lot more often in the weekly or biweekly demos or things like that. But those senior leaders aren't seeing the same things that they saw. They are not seeing those status reports anymore that they were very fond of. So sometimes that's why that feeling starts to creep in. So the other part is that a lot of times waterfall and old ways of working gave the appearance of certainty. So that now becomes a little more uncertain with agility, when really we were kind of fooling ourselves the whole time previously anyway. I worked with a PMO leader one time who came up to me and said, Stan, I know you're crazy about this Agile stuff, but I'm never going to be on board. And I looked at him and I said, Bob, and his name wasn't Bob, which is why he looked at me weird when I said that. But I said, Bob, I said, how do you feel that way? And he said, well, didn't you see our last quarterly report? Like, over 90% of our projects were on time, on budget, within scope. And I looked at him and I said, well, Bob, I did see that. And I said, let me ask you a question, though. How many of those projects were on time, on budget, within scope from the original charter that we built? And he looked at me and tilted his head sideways, and kind of like my dog looks at the dishwasher, and said, I don't know. And I said, I do. I looked it up. I said, 0. And I said, so maybe the question isn't why should you become agile, but how agile do you want to be? Because I would advocate that you're already starting to become a little bit more agile by making these changes. All I'm suggesting is a way to make it go even faster. And once I kind of put it in that context, he thought about it for a while. And look, I'm not going to lie, guys. He was never 100% on board with everything that we were trying to do. But he didn't fight as hard, and he understood why we were trying to do that. And we made some adaptations along the way to give him the comfort level that he needed for what he was trying to do for his role. And that's only right. So anyway, the point is that, again, we're making things more visible. That doesn't mean we're getting more capable. That just takes more time as well. So that's another reason why sometimes this feeling creeps in amongst senior leaders. So let's quickly go through the last 3 domains. These are a little bit more straightforward. Your planning and funding models. What does this look like in your organization? If you have your roadmaps that are treated like commitments, right? I've built this 2-year roadmap or this 1-year roadmap, or we have this annual planning process that's super rigid and you can't get anything new in, or it's really hard to get everything new in. Or maybe this feels more familiar, right? Toward the end of the year, you're going through stuff, you're meeting with your leaders, and they say, wait, all these other things over here, how come they're not done? And you say, well, because we brought in these other things over here. They say, yeah, but we approved for all that stuff to get done and it's not done. Well, we didn't get any more people. We kind of replaced this stuff over here with that stuff over there. That's what we did. So even though that seems like common sense to us, if we're not making that explicit throughout the year, then that is their takeaway. Hey, we approved these things to get done. Doesn't matter that all these other things came in. We are still assuming these other things are going to get done unless somebody has told us otherwise, which generally a lot of times we just don't do. But another one is sometimes adaptive planning is viewed negatively. If you've ever heard the comment, why didn't we know this at the start? Well, generally, even when we tried to do waterfall, we didn't know everything at the start. We just acted like we did. And so sometimes that having that kind of mindset, takes time to break that mold of really never did know everything at the start. Also, a lot of times estimates are compared to actuals, and they're used against people or teams. That's kind of why this group feels like they're on trial here. If that is happening, it really shouldn't, right? Like if that's happening in your organization, you really shouldn't be doing that, because, think about it this way. I have a to-do list that I have around the house every weekend. And every weekend, invariably, I don't get that list done. Now, sometimes it's because I just didn't get through it fast enough. I may have had to make more trips to the hardware store than I originally thought I would, because I thought I had everything I needed, but I didn't. Or I have 2 kids and they break something and now that gets replaced on something else. Or my wife comes up and says, hey, I need you to do this, or I need help with that. And so you drop what you're doing and go do those things. So no matter what, things always take longer than what we thought. And software engineering is way more complicated than anything that I'm doing around the house. I can promise you that. So kind of using that analogy has helped me a lot too. So if this is something that resonates with you, any of these things around planning, around funding, what can you do? Number one, add language to your roadmaps and include commentary like as of this date, right? That also automatically implies that that's going to change over time. Or just flat out state that. Say, hey, this is going to change. One thing I've done before is I've provided release notes just for my roadmap, right? So because when somebody looks at a roadmap 1 month and then it changes, they may not immediately connect the dots on what changed. So what I've done is I've just actually put the document out there, say, hey, here's what's changed since the last time you saw this roadmap. Pick out delivery plans from roadmaps so that you have a forecast from your commitment or your plan to deliver what you are going to deliver, and those two things should be very separate. And the last one is to measure those learning and outcomes and include them in your status reporting. A lot of times senior leaders just see a really big bar on a roadmap and they think like, hey, when this is done, it's done. If it's not done, it's not done, right? I mean, that's common sense. But if along the way you're saying, hey, look at this capability that your users have that they didn't have before. Yes, this project, this effort, this initiative is still going on and on and on, but look at these things that they can do now, or look at what the team is able to do now that they couldn't do before. We're able to deploy an AI agent within our tool. We were never able to do that before. We were able to do X, Y, or Z, right? So really shouting that out in your status reporting, or if you're on the engineering side, making sure your delivery person or people put those things in their status reporting, celebrate those things, show off what the team is actually able to do or what your customers can do now or your users can do that they couldn't do before. That's just as, if not more important than the rest of the status report. All right, technical architecture. What does this look like? Deployment bottlenecks due to overlaps or coupling, right? Everything has to go through this. If you're still working with teams that they have to do the deployments, right? Or you have to these environments that don't allow that flexibility, or you have a gatekeeper dependency. There's only, hey, we can't work on this one effort or this product because only Jane can do that and she's on vacation, right? She's the only one that really knows that application inside and out. Or this age-old story of tech debt that weighs down, hey, we want to build this sports car, we want this thing to go fast, but we've got all this tech debt and it's going to weigh us down. It's going to cause this thing to really bog down. That is inevitably going to happen if we don't prioritize it. So what can you do here? Number one, consider an architecture review board, right? So that you can really kind of make sure that decoupling starts to happen. Maybe you don't have the time or the energy or the ability to do an architecture review board. Maybe you just pick the 2 or 3 products or systems that are constantly in conflict and constantly coupled up and work, have those architects work together to try to decouple that. Say, hey, let's try to come up with a smarter design here. The second thing is experiment on reducing coupling, but incrementally, maybe reserving some capacity. Sometimes that works, but I will tell you that my practical experience, when you kind of say, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to spend 70% of our time doing new functionality, 20% of our time on tech debt, 10% on bugs. Invariably, what happens is there's something that's more important that's new functionality, or there are more bugs than we considered, or both. And what always gets squeezed out is that 20% for tech debt, or whatever percentage you're putting in there for it. It always seems to go away. So rather than do that, what I would recommend is doing this last thing on this list, which is prioritize your modernization in the same place as your business-focused efforts. So if you're a product person, making sure you really understand what tech debt needs to be worked on, what the impact of that work will be. If you're an engineer, make sure that you're escalating those things to your product person so that they can advocate for it, or be in the prioritization meetings yourself with stakeholders. And if you prioritize those things, yes, it's going to take a while. There's not going to be a single person on the business side that's ever going to say, yes, let's make sure we put that tech debt first right out of the gate. It's going to take time and it will take a lot of conversation, but over time, they will start to see the value of working on the tech debt. All right, let's talk about our 6th one, incentives and metrics. So sometimes we look at all of our metrics and we say, yay, they're all green, we're doing great, but your users are still frustrated. Does that sound familiar? Which, by the way, side note, you see uptime on here. Uptime is a wonderful thing to make sure you're measuring and keeping track against. I just put 3 on this slide, but uptime is a good one. But if you're looking at things that are like utilization, number of points that each engineer did, and you're using that as a function of efficiency or progress, or the number of features we deliver, we're just checking the box without caring about, things like that. I will tell you a quick story that I had. What happened to me once. I had a leader come up to me. We had 4 lines of business that fed into all of our teams. And he said, hey, the next quarter, we have to deliver 800 points of value to this one line of business, because we were supposed to do 600 and we shorted them 200. We only got 400 done, so we've got to do 800. I said, hey, it's not a problem. We can have that for you tomorrow. And he looked at me and he said, what? How? And I said, I'm going to take this 1 point story, call it 800. And he said, that's ridiculous. I said, so is worrying about how many points we're delivering as a measure of our value. So what we need to be focused on is not these local or team-based metrics. Should we look at those team-based metrics? Absolutely, but we should be sharing that with the teams and working within our teams to try to improve. That's not something that across the org is going to lead to greater efficiency, more value, faster time to market. Those things those outcomes we're trying to get to, using those kinds of metrics is not going to get us there. So what can we do from our seats? Suggest a new outcome or a new value-based metric. Just do it on a trial basis with one team, one art, something, again, lower visibility. Reduce that metric overload by asking leaders to prioritize their metrics. If you're measuring 20 things or 10 things or 5 things even, just go to each leader and ask them, what are your top 2? And you'll be surprised that most leaders will agree on the top 2. There might be 3, there might be 4, maybe. But most of the time, leaders are going to agree on the most important metrics. So you say, hey, we can keep tracking those things in the background, but what if we only look at those things for a little bit and we see if that actually makes our lives a little bit easier? And again, maybe that gives you the space to introduce a new one that is more value-based. And then again, reporting that learning and those learning and outcome wins, right? Those are big deals and they should be reported. Those should be metrics. How much of the team learning? What are the capabilities that we're building that we didn't have before? How many outcomes that improve our customers' lives were we able to deliver? And what did those look like? What was the value that we delivered to those customers? So if we work on those 6 constraints, we should be able to move from a transformation to an evolution, because a transformation implies a finish line. At some point, we're done. An evolution is forever ongoing. So what does that look like? Well, the first step, hey, we start with a transformation. We do have to transform. We can't evolve unless we start the process. Again, visibility increases. Our constraints become visible. So again, nothing's changed yet, right? This is exactly as it was before. However, now we recognize there's a need to evolve. There's a capability that we need to build. So we work on that. We put an action plan in place to improve or build that capability. Now, instead of getting frustrated, we continue to recognize another need and we build a capability there. And we see the next evolution need. We continue to grow those capabilities. And now we are continuously adapting. So what's the difference between a transformation and evolution? Well, if you're part of a transformation, you're going to implement a framework. You're going to create new meetings or events, maybe some new team alignments, different org charts. You're going to change some team processes. You're going to introduce what adaptability is and what it means. And it's probably going to have some kind of completion date. This is when we're done, right? Whereas in evolution, we're really talking about systems thinking here. Everything that I have been talking about to this point, if you are not deeply involved in systems thinking, start looking into it, because systems thinking is really important. We are all part of a system, and when you affect something in one part of the system, or even more importantly with an agile transformation, you don't change things throughout the rest of the system, the part that you are trying to change is only going to see so much growth and so much improvement. They will hit a ceiling very quickly. You should be analyzing your constraints. If you've not heard of the theory of constraints, you should absolutely be learning about that, because that's a huge part of an evolution. You're using organizational design and learning. Your leaders and your stakeholders participate and are actively working to change and adapt as well. Your governance and your organization also evolves. And that will lead to, instead of just a stop date or a finish date, a reduction of friction over time and increased intentionality. So, but what you need to know is there are things you can control. You are not going to control the design of your organization. You are not going to control your funding model. You are not going to control your governance, and you're not going to control your leadership. So if you try to fix those things, you're only going to get frustrated. But what can you do? You can surface friction safely. You can improve your quality of your visibility. You can map constraints that you see. You can reduce dependency pain by making suggestions or experimenting. You can clarify decisions to make sure that that's actually what the leadership team is looking for. You can improve conversations with your leadership team. You can create learning loops. Those are things you can do regardless of where you sit. Now, I have developed a diagnostic tool that will walk you through those things, those 6 constraints, and will also give you suggestions based kind of similar to what I've done in the talk. It just goes into a little bit more depth. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to me and let me know. But in summary, transformations don't stall because teams don't want to change or leadership doesn't want to change. I have never seen that happen once. They stall because the organizational systems evolve. Your system evolves more slowly than that visibility that the transformation creates. So that's where the problem comes in. You're increasing visibility quickly, but your organization moves slowly. And that's the capabilities just take time. So what can you do next? If you're watching this and you're saying, where do I start? Number 1, use that tool. If you don't have it, like I said, reach out to me. I'm happy to share. Start with suggestions on that are provided in that diagnostic tool, but utilize your own knowledge because, look, it's just a starting point. It's not an all-inclusive list of things you might be able to do to influence those things and work on some of those constraints. So use your own. You know your organization better than I do. Start an experiment. And one little tip that I'm going to give you is try to not create a new meeting. Nobody wants a new meeting. So if you can incorporate an experiment within the meeting structures that you already have, that's going to go a lot further than setting something up that's new. And finally, for me, I would love to see this. If you want to see this tool online, I would love to know that. People can just use it online. Like I said, I'm spinning up continuous evolution. It's going to take time to get my website and other things up. But once I do, if this is something you would like to see, I would love to put it out there. But if there's any other feedback, anything I can do to improve it, I would love that feedback as well. So wrapping up, transformations shine the light. Evolution is the work that follows. And I would argue that a lot of times evolution is harder than transformation. So these are all things that I've pulled from in my history, in my past, continue to try to learn from. And so is there a direct correlation to everything in what I've talked about? No, but a lot of this stuff, so these are areas that you can't go wrong, on doing research in any of these areas. And finally, and most importantly, connect with me, please. If we're not connected, I would love to connect with you. Like I said, there's going to be a whole lot more that's going to come with my website and everything else. It's going to take me some time to get there because I do work full time, but I would love to be able to help you. If I can be of service to you, if I can help you, please, please, please reach out. Let me know. Hopefully this was useful to you, but I would love to hear your feedback. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention and hoping that everything goes well for you in the future.